How do we know that we know what we say we know? An epistemological foray into poker. I actually made a video this morning, Melissa, that featured a concept called the exploitative mist, which was this
Mm.
idea that students have formulated habits, bad habits in many cases, where they sort of regurgitate old thoughts, such as they never bluff, or they never fold, or this is strong, this sizing is strong, or this sizing is value-y. And it's this kind of pseudo made up hand reading that's not even really real, but it's become habitual and it's been ritualized. And I think this is a huge problem for poker players. And again, this is coincidental because this week you told me that you wanted to talk about this. How do we know what we think we know, what we say we know? Let's do it. Let's explore this more. What got you thinking about this topic in the first place?
Yeah. I was reading an article. I don't know if you heard about this, but um, Bill Lee, he invented Cash App, and he's kind of like he was a big celebrity in the kind of tech world in San Francisco. Well, he was leaving dinner one night. This was a couple months ago, and he was killed. He was stabbed to death, and it wasn't a robbery. It just seemed like it was kind of a random crime. And I was um after it happened, a number of different people in the tech community, a lot of like the big kind of celebrities who are involved with like companies like the social media companies and things like that, kind of came out and said, this is obviously like another symptom of San Francisco's decline. San Francisco is known to be, it has a big problem with homeless people. It has a lot of crime, a lot of drugs, like the same problems that plague a lot of American cities right now, but it's especially acute in San Francisco. And the kind of blame was put collectively on the city for not enforcing the laws and allowing these kinds of crimes to increase. And this poor guy was a victim of this terrible crime. Well, it came out a couple days later that the person who was responsible for the murder was actually a friend of his, who was also in the tech community, who was also a very wealthy kind of entrepreneur. And there had been some kind of personal problems between them. It had to do with like a woman one of them was dating, and he just kind of snapped and killed him. And the next day, there's a big article in the New York Times about how all of these tech personalities, many of whom are kind of more on the libertarian conservative side of things, they're so biased, they're so quick to judge San Francisco. They're so quick to reinforce their narrative about how crime is rampant, when in reality, this was a murder that had nothing to do with all of these problems like homelessness and drugs and crime and everything. And isn't this such a terrible example of bias? And I was thinking about this, and I actually think the answer to that question is no, it's not. And I think when we talk about knowledge and why we do what we do and why we form the opinions we form and why we come to the conclusions we come to, we never, maybe in some rare cases we have perfect information, but we hardly ever do. And we're making decisions based on what we knew, our personal history, our personal knowledge, our interpretation of events that are kind of filtered through our own life experiences, our own knowledge of the world, et cetera, et cetera. There's a number of different data inputs that are going into any decision we make or any conclusion we come to, whether it's in a poker game or whether it's on a political issue, whether it's what to eat for lunch, et cetera. So I think this example is interesting because the original opinion that San Francisco is kind of become this hellhole and therefore innocent people are being murdered is true. That is factually true. There are innocent people being killed and the city is a mess. The fact that this one murder happened to involve two people who knew each other doesn't change that underlying truth. And it also is not, I think, a flaw for people who live in San Francisco, who are in the tech community, who are going to work every day and seeing what San Francisco is like, to form a conclusion based on those external factors. It's not necessarily bias. It's not a flaw to make a decision based on what you know at the time. Now, there's a caveat to that. Obviously, as human beings, we have internal biases. We operate on stereotypes that sometimes are unfair, et cetera, et cetera. But this statement about San Francisco was made when these tech guys made it, was made with the caveat that we don't know what happened, but we would assume based on what we know that this was a homeless person, this was someone that was on drugs, et cetera, et cetera. So translating that to poker, it made me start thinking about, well, when we're at in a poker session, we're making hundreds of decisions throughout the session that are based on this very same thing. And so I was hoping that maybe we could start with you explaining a little bit about why, we as players would we understand that there's a theoretically correct way to play a certain node, and why we would deviate from that, and how that does that factor into kind of our toolkit as poker players.
Yeah, for sure. So I think I agree, first of all, about the story. I think sometimes people round up their percentage of being certain about something. So it could be that the commentators in that situation were 90% confident that, given the nature of most crimes in San Francisco of that sort, that a homeless person or drugs or the crime problem would be the source of it. And they don't necessarily state that when they say, this is an eye-opener, we need to look at this. And therefore, to say that that's bias, to blame something that is 80 to 90% going to be the cause of something, I agree that's not the right word. It's maybe a rounding up type of assumptiveness when they say it with full conviction, but I wouldn't say it's bias. It's like in poker. If I say, oh, you're never folding that spot, Melissa, I'm not going to bluff there because you're never folding that spot. But what I really mean is that you're folding like sub 10% of the time, and I need 33% fold equity to make the half pot size bet I was contemplating. Well, now saying you're never folding, it's job done, it's good enough, right? The standard of how explicit I need to be there about how sure I am is fairly loose. Like, I don't need to actually posit whether I'm 90% sure or 100% sure, because either way it's good enough. But when it comes to like convicting someone of a crime or something like that, we have to be like close to 100% sure, right? Maybe we can't be like literally 100% sure, but it wouldn't be right to say, well, a homeless person is probably responsible for that murder, so let's like exonerate anyone who's not a homeless person. That would be like completely ludicrous, and in that case 80 to 90% certainty is just not good enough. So I guess, how does this relate to poker? Like, how certain do we need to be, and how precise do we need to be about how certain we are? This is an important thing. Well, binary thinking is a disease, it's a plague in poker, and probably in many areas of life as well. So when people say they're not folding top pair here, or I don't think they're bluffing this node, that's actually binary thinking. It might not be expressed as always or never, but to me, when you don't qualify something with a frequency modifier, like sometimes, usually, 80%, etc., you're actually making a binary claim. And students do this all the time. Like, I had a hand, I was talking about the exploitative mist at the start of this session, and a new student the other day who's going to hate me for like making YouTube content about this hand and also talking about it in my podcast about a hand where he made a mistake. But basically the student could have bluffed the turn or the river in a spot that I think population overfolds dramatically, having checked and capped their range. So basically like the villain checked behind in the cutoff on a board of 5-4-3 monotone, and the turn was an offsuit 7. Or was it 5-4 deuce? No, it's 4-3 deuce monotone. The turn was an offsuit 7. And I said there that the student had like some kind of gutter, and I kind of said, queen 6, let's say, said, should definitely lead here. Pool's grossly over defending. They're not checking enough flushes. They're not checking enough sets. They're not protecting the checking range. You know this pattern, Melissa. You play in these games too. You know the score. It went check, check. The river came the king of flush. And clearly the student should just bet against Pool here. They didn't bet the turn. They should definitely now stab the river with queen high. You're going to get more fold equity than you need for almost any sizing. Without getting too technical, that's a spot where you should certainly bluff. So I said to the student checked down and somehow won against Jack High. And I said, neither of you deserve to win that hand. That was an abomination of a hand. But long story short, I said, why didn't you bet either the turn or the river? And he said, well, I thought their range was just going to be mainly like slow played flushes and over pairs, and there was no fold equity. So accidentally, through the tunnel vision of binary thinking, the student has dialed in narrowly with the blinkers on onto solely the hands that beat him, right? Only the hands that beat him as he actually bothered to think about here. And that's a very natural thing to do. And we do this all the time in life as well. We dial into the factor we're most afraid of. Oh, I'm leaving the house. Have I locked the door, for example? The factor I'm most afraid of comes to mind the most naturally in pretty much all situations. And it does in poker as well. But that can really be to our detriment when we think in that way. So, epistemologically speaking, I think it's always our prerogative when we're playing poker to ask ourselves, when we express a certain sentiment, have we zoomed out enough, or are we too dialed in on one specific factor? Because we can't see the full picture if we're only looking at the top right-hand corner of it. And then secondly, how sure are we of the thing that we're actually seeing, and how can we be sure, and have we been precise enough about how sure we are? So when he says, I don't think they're folding here. Well, it's a binary claim. Strike one, binary claim, in a spot that has to be expressed gradably. Have to express fold equity gradably there. So strike one, binary. Strike two, you've made an assumption that you've not thought through. You've just said the first thing that comes to your head without any evidence. You've not actually been able to back it up. And strike three, you've been careless about your certainty level. You've not asked yourself, how certain am I about that, right? So I think what you brought up there, Melissa, that story, has a lot of impact on the poker player's day-to-day life as well in those three ways. Don't be binary. Definitely make sure you think through things and have reasons for things first, and then actually be careful to express your degree of confidence or certainty in a claim that you're making.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the other part of it that factors in as well is, what is the underlying emotion? So we like to, I think of ourselves as rational, logical thinkers, and especially at the poker table, I think most players would say that emotional reactions is kind of the enemy. It's kind of a sign of it's a sign of weakness. It's not a sign of strength. Whether you're celebrating because you won, or whether you're depressed because you lost, or whether you're acting out of an emotion, no one wants to admit that. But I do think that is a big part of our decisions, and it's not necessarily like if you were going to take a pie chart of like what goes into a decision, it's not necessarily a slice of the pie, but it underlies the pie, and it's part of the ingredients. And so, and when that story you're just talking about your student, I've been there, and I once thought like that too, in the sense of like, oh, well, I think here are the hands that beat me, and here's all the reasons why my opponent can have these hands in this spot. Well, what does that come from? That comes from, I think, a fear. It comes from a sense of not wanting to put myself into a situation that's going to be harmful or painful or stressful. So if I were to bet, what do I do when I get raised? Or if I were to bet and I get called and I have to show down my queen high hand, and they show down a flop flush, I'm going to look like an idiot in front of all these players. So those emotions, I think, are also something that are present. And I think maybe for newer players, those thoughts like, I'm going to look like an idiot, what do I do if I get raised, are a bigger piece of the pie. But even for, I think, after you've been playing for a little while, and I haven't been playing for a long time by any means, but I think because I've kind of cycled through a lot of these thought processes, I can recognize them in myself. And one of the things that I recognize is, it may not be a thought process like, what happens if I get raised, or I don't want to look like an idiot. I don't care about any of those things. More so the looking like an idiot. But what underlies my fear is more kinds of bigger thoughts of like, okay, well, here's the logical way to react to this, but what happens if if they show cards that are completely, like the one hand that beats me, or what if the worst thing possible that can happen is going to happen here? What does that mean for me? And then those feelings are kind of underlying decisions. So what happens if this puts me into a spot where I'm no longer feeling secure? So in other words, it's not so, the thought process is not so logical as to have no emotion involved whatsoever. maybe there's players out there that operate without emotion, but I personally believe that that's an illusion. And I think all human decisions are based in some degree on emotion, whether we recognize it or not. Um, so I think when we're talking about what do we know, why do we know it? Yes, we know things based on external data that we have, this player type, this spot, maybe our history of being in this spot before, what we know from maybe studying this certain spot, what we know from maybe playing against this particular opponent before, all of these things that go into our decision. Yes, they are all there, and they're big pieces of the pie, along with things like, what is my fold equity here, et cetera, et cetera. But there also is emotion. And I think recognizing that is not a bad thing. And also not pretending it doesn't exist is a good thing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think in the Queen Six, like the thing that's going on there is a long-term ingrained protective mechanism against bluffing. Because what the
Mm-hmm.
student's subconscious is kind of accidentally, but in a very sort of human nature pre-programmed way, decided to do is assess over the long term how it generally feels to bluff and have it work versus how it feels to bluff and get called. And the student actually said this, that he thinks that the risk reward, actually this is a different student I'm going to now. I actually had 2 sessions yesterday where both times the focus was, the student isn't bluffing enough. Why are they missing all these mandatory bluffs? How do we fix it? And the student in the morning, the afternoon one was the one with the Queen Six, the one in the morning was actually saying the reason I don't bluff in spots where I probably should is that I know that if it works, I'll experience a brief sense of relief, like I got away with something, like thank God I stole that thing out of the shop and the police weren't called, I got away with it, for example. And when it doesn't work, the student experienced extreme self-loathing and regret and just like intolerance for the play that he just made. So it's like, well, if that's your trade-off, if that's what we're looking at here, no wonder you choose not to go ahead with that bluff. The underlying emotion is misfiring. It's trying to protect the student from that trade-off not being in his favor. And for as long as that trade-off remains not in the student's favor, the trade-off between relief when a bluff works and misery and self-loathing when it doesn't, the student won't bluff. So the only way around it is to recognize the emotion, which is doing a protective role there, and trying to disarm it or redirect it somewhere else. In other words, if we can engage with the sort of vulnerable child schema that's trying to protect the adult from pressing the bluff button, well, the idea is that we'll be okay because the child will no longer be afraid, bluffing won't seem scary anymore, and then we can bluff. But the only way to do that, as you say, is to engage with the emotion and accept it. This idea that, like, emotions are weak and therefore bad for poker players, it's like, yes, but you still have them, so that's a problem for you, huh? You've deemed them weak garbage that you'd rather be rid of, but given that you still have them, that's an issue. It's like if you had a horrible, debilitating disease, let's say you had, I don't know, tuberculosis, and you urgently needed treatment for tuberculosis, and you said, I don't fucking care about tuberculosis, man. Tuberculosis is a scummy, shitty disease that goes after weak people, preys on weakened lungs and immune systems, thrives in dirty environments. Fuck that. I'm not giving that my time. That's for the weak. It's like, yeah, but you have it and it's going to kill you if you don't do something about it.
Exactly. But it's also just like this need to not want to have emotions is in itself an emotional reaction.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like, it's just like, okay, why not? Why do you not want to have emotions? Well, it gets you to the same place. There's kind of a regress to it. So yes, I 100% agree that learning to love your own emotions, learning to understand that you're going to feel a certain way about certain things and you can't help it. And honestly, that's fine. That's okay. I was listening to another podcast this week and they were talking about how like one of the things that certain personality types do, especially people that are like overachievers or very conscientious people, you have a kind of ingrained guilt about feeling things. So if you feel things that you in your perception throw you off a kind of path that you are on, so things like exhaustion, things like boredom, things like anger, sadness, depression, all of these things, that your ingrained response is to feel bad about feeling that way,
Yep.
like you've done something wrong, and that the first step in really bringing any kind of not even like curing yourself of something, but just bringing some kind of inner peace, some kind of just ability to relax, is saying it's okay to feel this way. It's okay to have this emotion. Like that's okay. So I think in a poker session, yeah, you can totally feel things like, I don't want to lose this pot, or I'm a little bit afraid of what happens if I get raised here, or God, I feel like an idiot for making that play. Those are all normal emotions. Like you're not a bad player because you have those emotions. And I think good players actually fully embrace those emotions and engage with them and realize them. And I think you can also have those emotions without being like, super snarky about it. Like sometimes like you see this a lot on poker Twitter, where people say things like they over exaggerate like how bad they played in a certain spot, as a way of like, I think it's like kind of like projection psychologically of beating themselves up over it, but doing it at public forum where it almost becomes like a joke. Like, look at me, look how ridiculous I am for this in this spot. Um, and I think like all of that is unhealthy. I personally, like, my goal whenever I'm feeling anything at the table is to recognize, well, where is this coming from? And is this something that I need to address or not? And so one of the things that happens to me sometimes is when I'm like, particular players will annoy me at a table, or they'll do something that I find like really bad, like a bad play, and they'll win, or they'll behave in a certain way that I find kind of obnoxious. And it'll start making me internally feel like, oh, I hope that person like loses the next pot they're in. Even if it's not with me, even if I'm not in that pot, I'm like, oh, I have these like kind of like winners and losers in my head, and I want this person to lose and that person to win. It's completely absurd. It's totally weird, and it's not healthy. And so when I recognize that happening, I think to myself, why am I doing that? Why am I feeling that way? And normally it's because I'm angry at myself for what I feel was a mistake, or I feel like I should be playing better, et cetera, et cetera. So bringing this back to kind of, how do we know what we know? I think when we're talking about our data inputs, we have to understand that those data inputs are going to be colored by emotion. They're going to come through a kind of emotional filter and be either increased, amplified by that emotion, maybe decreased. We talked last week about, sometimes if you have a couple drinks at the table, you have blinders on, and, the information you receive is like really blinkered and not at all it's not the entire picture. All of those emotional kind of filters, you have to understand what those dials are turned up to, what those filters are doing when you process that information.
Yeah, they're like the static that's going on. Like if you turn on an amp, for example, and the gain is set too high for the sound coming in, it's going to be like, and it's going to like start to dominate through the sound of you playing the guitar or whatever, and that's a bit of an issue. But that's emotional interference, right? Where the emotional backdrop hasn't been properly dealt with, and thus it's too high, and it's causing the poker player's thoughts to get distorted and manipulated and skewed towards the desired outcome. That's probably what happens in the Queen 6 example. The student briefly contemplates whether they should bet the turn, and the emotional backdrop is just sort of very much pushing all the thoughts that come in one direction, kind of bending those waves towards the check button instead of the bet button. Another way to see it, and a more sort of a stronger way of viewing it actually, is that in some cases the emotion is so strong that it's the thing actually creating the pseudo logic, I call it, like the logic that people are actually speaking in their mind, in their sort of mental voice about the hand, is nothing but a kind of contrived, manipulated, puppet mastered rendition of their emotions. So for example, if I'm in a spot where I'm literally petrified of calling your all in, and I know that I should start trying to hand read and think about your player type and think about the action sequence thus far and your landing range of hands on the river and what you're likely to do with it. But instead, I just feel a petrifying fear, and I literally turn to stone. That's what petrified means, audience, by the way. It comes from Petros, stone, same as my name. But yeah, you literally freeze up, and then you kind of go, oh, how can I explain this thing I'm feeling? Is there a narrative that sounds kind of logical, like it might be poker speak, that can actually just get the emotion what it wants, because the emotion is like this massively powerful, irresistible force, basically. And so the poker pseudologic will just say something like, yeah, this is an underbluff spot, or oh, I would call if I had the jack of diamonds, or oh, I blocked too many bluffs. Just finding like one or two convenient excuses that aren't sufficient reasons. And I'm always saying to students, put your reasoning through the sufficiency test. Ask yourself if there is any other thing that you could think here that seems true that would actually invalidate your reason that you just, or would be stronger than the reason you've just given there that would push you in another direction. So in other words, could there be something I could think about calling being good that would actually invalidate my excuse for folding, that I didn't have the jack of diamonds, or whatever that minute little blocker thing could be? But when the emotional sound wave is too strong and it's basically pushing the direction of all the poker narrative thoughts, we end up in a spot where we normalize a particular type of thought because it's convenient to that puppet master emotion. And then poker thoughts become the puppets and the emotion is the puppet master pulling them. And we're like the viewer watching all of this play out. And it's like, well, at what point do we intervene? Well, in order to get the puppet master, the emotion, to do something different, we need to either tame it so we can take control of the puppets, the thoughts, or we need to sort of understand it, you know, like you said, sort of compassionately understand it, reason with it, accept it, listen to it. If an emotion feels, I'm really personifying emotions here, but if an emotional type of persona in your psyche feels listened to and attended to, it's like a child. It's much less likely to keep harassing you and bothering you and tantruming and dominating the whole show. So I would say that when you're feeling that big resistance towards bluffing or towards making that call, that might be okay. Engage with the emotion first and say, well, I can't actually know anything until I've tamed this beast. This beast is creating such a ruckus that it's actually so loud that it's impossible for me to have neutral, independent thought right now. So a big part of what do we know and how do we know that we know it is I've been able to carry out an objective sort of analytical thought process in an emotionally calm enough environment that I can trust the output. Because it's like, if you try to measure how far you can blow something by just literally blowing on it, and you try to measure like how far I can blow like a bit of paper across the table or something like that, and I measure that in my kitchen, I can measure that pretty accurately, right? How far can I blow that piece of paper if I take a deep breath and I blow it across the table? But if I ask myself, well, how far can I blow that piece of paper during like a massive storm, like during a hurricane, I can't measure that anymore, right? So we have to calm down the emotion sometimes in order to have the right level of, the base level of noise, in order to actually see if we know what we know. So maybe a good litmus test here is just to say, did I conduct my thought process in a neutral enough environment? Maybe we can never be completely objective, completely unbiased, but can I do it in a calm enough environment, emotionally speaking, to have confidence that if my logic is sound, that my conclusion is sound? Because the thing is that emotion invalidates your argument, because it means that you're likely to choose only the premises that fit your narrative, and they will not be sufficient for your conclusion. So you'll actually be making an invalid argument. Many of the times you conduct that thought process under emotional duress. So step one, accept the emotion. Step two, engage with it, listen to it. What's it trying to say? It's okay to feel that way. That's a huge thing. If you reject it, you'll find pseudological excuses for it. So if I say, it's unacceptable that I feel like not bluffing this turn, that's the thought of a little bitch. I'm being a little bitch in this spot, let's say. Something like that. That's unacceptable. I should be a man. I should be a man and not feel that way. Well, now I have to come up with an excuse for why I still don't want to bluff the turn, because guess what? I still don't want to. It doesn't go away. And now I say something like, do never fold. And I've normalized a garbage, convenient narrative thought. So instead, we have to listen to it. We have to accept it. And only then can we move on. So that's emotions. How else, what else gets in the way of the ability to know if you truly know what you know? What other epistemological concerns do we have about the poker player?
I think the input of the data itself. So rather than, moving away from the emotion, what is actually the quality of the data we're using. So like if you're going to conduct a scientific study, well, the result of that scientific study is going to be crap if you're using terrible inputs, if your data is terrible, if your sample size is like, you know, like 2 people in a population, and you're going to come up with a conclusion about the whole general population. I mean, this was like a, and still remains like a really big problem with any kind of any kind of stories about COVID and mask wearing and all of that. I mean, the sample sizes were just all ridiculous. They had all of these factors that were just absolutely kind of absurd, and they threw off the results. And I think were a big reason why we experienced the kind of global health crisis that we did, and also why no one has faith in health institutions anymore. Anyways, we don't. That's a long story that I don't think anyone wants to hear about here, but I think the quality of the data is really important. And on that note, I think that a kind of neat little trick that I do is, if I'm in a spot where I'm, put to a big decision, whether to call or whether to fold or something like that, I picture myself in the role of a judge. So what does a judge do? Well, in most common law systems around the world, a judge looks at evidence from one side and the evidence from the other side, compares the evidence from both. I'm not talking about jury trials. I'm talking about when a judge is making a decision about something. That judge then weighs the evidence against each other on a kind of scale, metaphorically speaking, and then comes up with answers the question to the best results, and then solves the problem for the 2 parties. Well, if we think about the role of a judge, well, if one party has like extremely strong evidence, they have all of this case law behind them, they have a really sound argument, they've done the research, they've really put forward like a really sound case, well, they're going to have a really good chance of winning if the other side has come forward and said, well, I can't find any cases that support what I want to say. This is kind of my opinion. I just feel like justice demands that I be awarded this, and I just feel like it's unfair if I lose. Well, that's crap, and that person's likely going to lose. And so, really, what you're bringing to this decision is really important. So, how does this relate to poker? Well, when you're thinking about the quality of the data, you're thinking about things like, okay, well, maybe we're talking about a player type. Well, this player type seems like they're really aggressive, and seems like they maybe have a lot of bluffs in this spot. Well, that may be very true, and you may be absolutely right, but you also may be wrong. And the harder part when you're talking about human beings and what individual human beings do, I'm not talking about the tendency of a pool of players, but individual players, what they do. In my experience, it's very hard to understand why human beings do anything. And what I find to be the case often is that I have to say to myself, I have no idea what this person's going to do. I have no idea why they're doing it, especially if you're playing against inexperienced players at lower stakes who do things for all different sorts of reasons. They spew at the weirdest times. They fold at the weirdest times. Sometimes they play optimally without even realizing it. That, all of these things happen that you have no control over. So I think maybe one mistake, or I would maybe call it a mistake, would be relying too heavily on the human factor. So putting that above other things like, fold equity, things like, what cards do I have versus my opponent's range, rather than this person is a whale, this person is a fish, this person's super nitty. They're not doing this unless they have it. Those things may be true in certain spots, but they also may not be true. And putting too much weight on that is like a judge looking at one side and saying, okay, well, you've come to me with 8 cases that support your opinion or your conclusion, and you've come to me with 10 cases that support your opinion, but this one case I really like, and not because it proves a kind of not because it proves a conclusion of law, but just because I relate to it and I think I understand it really well. I mean, that's kind of absurd, right? You're missing the much bigger picture, and you're intensely micro focusing on something that is one element of a much larger picture.
Yeah, and I think live players, they do that a lot of the time. Not just live players, but inexperienced online players as well, because they lack the structure of a good thought process and they don't really have all of the ingredients. Like, it's funny because before you've studied a lot of GTO, before you know game theory and how the game works objectively, there's almost nothing you can put in that abyss. You're left with this abyss of like, well, what do? I don't really know. I just need to like come up with a reason. And it's very convenient to think that you have reads that are stronger than they actually are, or maybe even just invent reads off the top of your head to conveniently fill that space. Whereas when you have a better theoretical thought process, and you can start off by saying, well, we know that the turn raised there is mostly going to be a range of semi-bluffs, sets, and straights for sets and straights for value, and then like flush draws and straight draws as the bluff region, maybe some pair plus draw, like when you know that's how the turn raising range is constructed in theory, and then most of the draws get there on the river and your opponent goes all in, it doesn't really matter what kind of player they are, unless they are like an absolute psycho that's like raising the turn with random hands that aren't even draws. They're going to really struggle to bluff often enough in that river. Like, any human is going to struggle to bluff often enough there. So having this situational awareness of like, what does game theory say is happening, and how far do I actually think my opponent is away from that, and in which direction, this really frames the question a lot better, and it makes it much easier to avoid the pitfall of putting too much weight on dubious or shaky data. So the data input thing is definitely another epistemological concern for the poker player. How do I know that the data I'm using, when it's of the read variety rather than the theory variety, is good or accurate? And how accurate is it? Because this is the thing, when I have a population read, even then, like you mentioned, you were just talking about individuals, but even if I have a population read, how do I really know like how good that is? Because it's so, I've seen this kind of group think, herd mentality so often in like poker study groups, where one person goes, they never bluff when they check raise flop, and then you have like 10 other people going, they never bluff when they check raise flop. It's like this dogmatic march of the poker zombies where they've heard this once and they repeat it like an echo, just reverberating around the place. And that's really dangerous. So it's like, do I believe something based on the merit of the thing that I'm actually contemplating? And this sounds really obvious. Like, in virtue of what do I know that a tomato in my fridge is a tomato? You would say tomato. That's silly, but that's another story. Melissa, I would say tomato. How do I know it's a tomato? Do I know it because someone told me it was? No. Do I know it because I've been saying that it is for a while? No. I know it is because I know what they look like, I know what the word means, and I'm able to pair the two together in some objective sense, where it's me problem solving right now that that thing in my fridge is a tomato. Now, when it comes to a read, such as they don't bluff this spot, for example, like a turn raise, let's say someone says they don't bluff here, pool doesn't bluff here. It's like, okay, so in virtue of what do you know that? Why is it that you know that? Do you know that because of your experiences and your careful analytics of that spot? Maybe empirically, maybe rationally, right? There's two ways that you can know things in general philosophy. There are empiricists and there are rationalists, right? There's other stuff in between as well. But broadly speaking, those are the two ways. Is it one of those? Do you have a rational relationship with the turn raise that clearly indicates to you that it's underbluffed for reasons, rational reasons, right? Or have you just seen lots of data, either mass data reports or courses? Or have you seen mass data from a coaching for profit school? Have you just been tracking these instances yourself and you're pretty confident that you've never seen bluffs there in that line and you trust yourself? Have you engaged in one of those two ways or both with the spot where you're making the read? Because if not, then it means that there's no direct, or at least there's an insufficient direct interaction between you and the subject matter, the tomato, or in this case, the turn raising range. Now, in that latter case, where there is no direct relationship or an insufficient one, it means that you've got the knowledge, or what you're calling knowledge. Knowledge, just by the way, is largely agreed upon to mean a justified true belief. There are a lot of caveats that go into that, but most philosophers agree that in order to know something, that thing needs to be true. You need to believe that it's true, and you need to have justification relevant to the thing that's true that explains why it's true. Now, if your justification for believing that the turn raise is underbluffed is that Greg said to you, your buddy Greg said to you, they don't bluff there, dude. and you like respect Greg, and you're like, oh, cool, Greg, thanks for that one, buddy. Then the next spot, you're like, they don't bluff there. Do you know that? Maybe Greg's right. Maybe it's true that they underbluff that spot, but you don't fucking know that, right? Because you have no direct empirical or rational interaction with the subject matter to say that you actually are justified in believing it for the right reason. So I think very often when people make these reads about populations or individuals, they're echoing things other people have said. They're getting scraps of evidence from maybe semi-similar situations they've been through in the past that aren't actually the same. Things like that. Maybe there's a directness test here. What's the direct interaction between me and the range that I'm looking at, and why is it I believe it to be what it is? And that might be hard to answer, but I think it's possible. Because if you ask me why I know, for example, that people who bet range lazily overfold to check raises on 8-8 deuce rainbow, I believe this to be true. Well, why do I believe that? Do I have an empirical interaction with that? Yes. I have two types of empirical interaction with that. I have mass data from a course that I've built called Grady of the Carrot Poker School, where I've looked at these nodes and their fold frequencies. I have empirical data from PioSolver, where I've compared continuance ranges with how my students think about the spot and how my students and poker peers react. And I have my own rational memory-based experience of how often people fold in that spot. And all three are strongly telling me that they overfold in that spot. Now, if you still want to doubt me in some Cartesian way where you're saying I don't know that my hand is my hand and I need to be skeptical about the existence of everything, then okay, maybe we have a different debate. But if you're not going to go that hard skeptical route, then I think you have to grant me some knowledge there, right? Because I've engaged in that empirical way. I can also engage in a rational way where I can just say, if people are going to see bet lots of junky looking hands, they will probably overfold by and large. Maybe not everyone, but pool probably will when they face the rates. Now, I've just shown you there, hopefully, Melissa, and the audience, that I can demonstrate a direct empirical or rational relationship between me and the claim that I'm making. And I think the lack of that in the thought processes of my students is the number one explanatory factor for why people constantly posit things they don't actually know as if they know them. We need that directness test a bit more, I think. Or maybe an indirectness test where you say, wait, I know that because Greg said it. That should ring an alarm bell. Greg said it and you didn't analyze it. Problem, right?
Right. But I think that all makes a lot of sense. And I think the one issue is that you encounter spots, especially as a newer player, and maybe I'm talking about myself here, someone who's really only played seriously for a couple of years now. You encounter spots that are foreign. So maybe you understand and you have that kind of rational empirical basis for knowledge when you're facing, a half pot size bet from the button and you're in the big blind, right? And button's kind of a fishy player. You understand kind of empirically what to do in that. You have that knowledge base, but there's situations where you don't. And so what are some ways that we can shore up those to ensure that what we're acting on, the data we're acting on, that we know what we know? What are some ways that we can kind of, even if we don't have that data that you were just talking about, that we can act empirically and rationally in a way that allows us to optimize these kinds of tools, just like we would in a situation where we recognize what to do and we have the data.
Yeah, so again, this isn't like a binary thing, and like you will have degrees of familiarity and comfort with different spots. So like just because I'm familiar with like facing a range bet on 8-8 deuce and I know that it's overfolded if I raise, it doesn't mean I know exactly what the weakest hand I'm allowed to bluff raise is in that new exploitative environment, right? I don't know. And similarly, there's loads of spots where I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm like completely lost and they're alien to me and I get them wrong because I didn't have the time, or there was too much emotional interference or whatever for me to like wade through the thought process properly. So some other things that we can do to make sure that we can trust what we know. Well, one simple answer to that is that you can't ever fully get to a point where you're able to sort of validate your own knowledge in a spot. You might just have to say, most of the time that I do this kind of calm deliberation, I get things more right than wrong, and at my current skill level, that's the best I can do. Maybe one answer to this whole problem is that the pursuit of perfect information and infallibility when it comes to poker knowledge isn't actually possible, but we should still be able to recognize what does the bad, biased, corruptible by emotion, sort of impulsive or copycat version of me sound like, and what kind of pitfalls does that person fall into compared with what does the A-game me, analytical me doing my best sound like. What are some qualitative differences? And I think they do concern things like emotional interference, directness, you know, what is the process, the structure. Like, for example, I know that when I start with a theoretical thought and then I ask what's different in the real world, I'm generally in a really good situation there. Whereas when I forget to follow that template, I'm not. So, for example, I made a blunder on the river the other day where I made a raise based on the thought that it was something like, this bluff raise might be okay in GTO. And then I did it. Now, how do you feel as a judge hearing that bit of evidence? This case might be sound. There you go.
Insufficient.
In theory. Like, in a very broad sense, in theory, this case might be sound. Like, yeah.
I would say that in theory you may be right, but I don't care.
And then I've not even said that I'm right in theory. I've just said it might be theoretically approved.
It might be, yeah. So I care even less.
I've basically said nothing. I've basically made a completely vacacious, empty comment, right? I've said nothing.
Yeah.
And then I acted on it. So, like, I know that's bad Pete. I know that's, like, sloppy, lazy, child, adolescent, wants to get drunk and be irresponsible and doesn't want to work kind of Pete. That's like me sat there being like, fuck, this is probably fine. Let's do it. That's a lack of willpower, you know? And when I see that, I'm able to say, well, if I'm in that spot again and I go, this might be fine because I have one blocker to the nuts, I should never act on a thought that sounds like that. But I know that when I have a thought process that goes, okay, what would theory demand of me here? What would theory require that I do? And in the spot in question, I had to have 2 straight blockers to make this ridiculous repolarizing river raise. Opponent potted river. To shove over the pot size bet, you need to have the absolute pinnacle of the blocker world to even make it acceptable in a spot like this. And I know this in game theory. So if I'd said, GTO demands the highest standards of blocker properties for my hand to bluff here, now I've at least started on the right foot. And then I can say, but what's the real world picture? Well, the real world picture is that someone that goes pot on the particular board in question is way under bluffing, is way too strong, and is under folding to a raise. So I should never raise, right? It was a huge blunder. And it's not difficult to see how I made that blunder. I was sloppy with my protocol. So maybe I would answer that question by saying, if your thought process follows the protocol of good, this is actually called reliabilism in epistemology, the idea that if you have conducted your inquiry, your truth-seeking inquiry, in a way that usually provides good results, then that can be deemed a reliable method of inquiry, and it can be trusted in the future to a high degree of confidence. Some people posit reliabilism as one of the epistemological theories to explain how we can actually know that we know things. We use a reliable method, right? So if I've conducted myself using this reliable investigative method on the river, then I can actually say, well, because that usually gives good results, or it gives 8 good results for every 2 bad ones or something like that, I'm going to act on it, yet I can still abstain from the perfect standard of how can we know for sure that we know. Maybe we can't, but through some kind of fairly strict but not overly strict reliabilism, by saying I've conducted my thought process in the right structure, I've done the theory, and then I've asked what's different in the real world. At least now I get like 8 or 9 out of 10 right, and maybe that's as good as I can do as a poker player.
That makes sense. So I think maybe we'll just kind of finish off with one more element that we maybe get wrong when we're trying to know what we know. And this, I think this is a new category, but maybe it's a continuation from our first category. But this idea that there's an underlying narrative to what is happening at the table. So we actually talked about this in the first episode of Poker Distilled, when we talked about unpacking the poker backpack. And one of the things we remove is this inclination we have to act upon narratives and to tell ourselves stories about what's happening. And I think it's maybe useful to expand on that a little bit here, because for someone like me, who's a bit of a creative thinker and someone who my mind tends to wander, especially if I'm a little bit bored, it's very easy. And I don't think this is unique to me. I think I see this with a lot of players, and because they say it at the table. They'll say something along the lines of, well, I made that call because I saw that you just lost a big pot a couple hands ago, and I thought you were really steamed up. I thought you were really angry. So I figured you were bluffing there. Something like that. Or this, I guess, fits into the never fold mentality. Also, it can be slotted in here too as well. But ultimately, it's this acting on knowledge that is formed from a kind of underlying temptation to impart order on something that is not orderly. So the poker table, the poker game, there's people are taught, this is in a live setting, people are talking, there's a lot of things going on in the room, all of this kind of external noise happening. And then there's the individual opponents at the table and these histories that you have with each opponent. Maybe it's a history that extends beyond that session. Maybe it's just a history in that individual session. And there's all these little narratives that your mind is constantly creating. And I think it can be a real mistake to act on that narrative and to give that narrative undue weight when we're trying to think about, okay, this is, in theory, this is kind of what theory is telling me this. Do I have any reason to believe that that's wrong, or that is not what's happening in the real world? Well, that's a pretty big question, because the idea is like, what is the real world? Is the real world a narrative that says this person who has been raising under the gun the last 5 orbits and has been showing bluffs is a really aggressive player? And so therefore they're going to act aggressive in this spot. That may be true, but it also may not. And so I think, as a kind of last point, this idea of the narratives we tell ourselves, the narratives our brain wants to make, and the kind of danger of acting on those narratives.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like that example you gave there, where some maniac has opened trash under the gun 5 times, then opens again, I think to not form the narrative that they're likely bluffing is a huge problem. Like if you were to look at that, so the problem on the other side is being unwilling to piece together narratives that actually are concrete and factual. So there, I think it would be really good to act on the fact that they're probably bluffing again and over bluffing, but still they could have it, right? We're not saying they don't ever have it here. We need to be careful about what we're actually claiming when we use these narratives. But the more problematic kind of narrative, I absolutely agree, is this sort of like, one recent thing has happened, which maybe 2 have happened, like maybe X and Y have both occurred, and both X and Y increase the probability that B is true instead of A. So then the flawed argument here is X and Y, therefore B. It's the flawed argument, because actually what you have is A and B are maybe equally likely, and because X and Y are true as variables, now B is 60% and A is 40%. And maybe in this spot, you actually need B to be much more than 60% in order for you to make an investment, depending on the situation. So this is what I would call like over strengthening a narrative, like making a narrative that's way more concrete and strong than what the true narrative actually should be. The simple fact about poker statements is that almost all of them should be expressed with some kind of frequency qualifier. So when I say Melissa's tilted, she's steaming, she's lost that last pot, I can see she was pissed off because she called the guy a moron after he slammed down his hand and whooped in celebration, which I believe you would do. And I believe that 100%
guy... 100% frequency.
100% frequency that you're pissed off after that happens, quite rightly so. But then it's like, well, now Melissa has 3-bet me in the cutoff. Now, how is her range different when I've opened hijack and she's in the cutoff in this situation? Is it that 10-8 off is now in her 3-bet range because of this anger? Like, evidently no. So the narrative is not strong enough to mean that she is 3-betting me with all hands or anything like that, or most hands or anything. Now, say she gets dealt Queen 10 suited, which is a hand that she could cold call with, or she could 3-bet with. Is it now likely that Melissa is 3-betting that at a higher frequency than her base strategy? yes, to some degree, that's probably now likely, right? So I feel it's okay for me to like use that information. But again, I'm being very careful that I quantify the narrative and only give it as much clout as I think it deserves. Now, what about the fact that Melissa doesn't have it here because she's tilted? Let's think about that claim. That's to say that if Melissa had kings, she wouldn't 3-bet me because she's tilted. That's absurd, right? So clearly when someone says, I thought you were bluffing because you were tilted, they don't mean that they don't think that you would have 3-bet them with kings. So actually, they don't mean that at all. So why have they said something they didn't mean? Because they're lazy and they forget to include frequency qualifiers, which we should include in all walks of poker life. We should always include them. So I think as long as your narrative is kind of sugar-coated with some kind of, or that's the wrong word, galvanized, shall we say, with some kind of frequency modifier, then it'll be okay. So if I sit there and say, I'm going to call Melissa's 3-bet with 10-9 suited, which is normally a mix, because one, I believe her 3-bet range will be a bit weaker here, so she'll have like over pairs less often than normal, slightly. And two, I think she's more prone to make mistakes post-flop right now than normal. So I'm going to call a hand that's usually break-even against her and expect it to be slightly winning. That's an excellent use of a narrative because I've actually made sure that I don't give the read more of a podium, more of a stage than it actually deserves. And I've certainly not gone so far to as actually say that I think you're bluffing. That's such a crazy thing to say. The words we use in poker are really, really important. The way we express things semantically really matters. And you know how I feel about censorship and cancel culture and changing the way people have to, you know, use words in normal life. You know how I feel about that. I absolutely fucking hate it. But in poker, I'm a massive stickler for using the right language. Because only when you express things with the right language do you not break the jigsaw puzzle. If you imagine that using the right language in poker is like inserting a piece, a thought into the jigsaw puzzle of your poker thought process, and you bend one of the corners of that piece and then try to put it in anyway, and you do that with every piece you put into the puzzle, what does the puzzle look like when it's finished? It's a mess, right?
Yeah.
Doesn't even fit together anymore. Pieces that should fit together no longer fit together because of your clumsy puzzle piece jamming, because you were too much of an ogre to sit back and say, what's the frequency that this actually affects at? To what extent is this gradable claim true? You know? How much?
Yeah.
If I said to you, let's talk about just countable and uncountable for a second. If I was like, how much milk would you say this is, Melissa? And you were like, 412. I'd be like, what on earth are you talking about? You've not specified a measurement. You've just given it a random number. You can't just black and white quantify things. You can't answer non-yes or no questions with yes. You know, you have to give an amount. You have to quantify what unit of measurement the 412 is. You have to be precise. You can't just lazily throw out reads and say, I thought you were bluffing because you were mad.
Right.
What a stupid thing to say. I rest my case.
But what this precision also does, and I can speak to this because in my own poker vocabulary, you know, this is something I'm really aware of and still doing, but it strengthens your foundation and it really ensures that the data you're using is the right data and the best data, so that you're not by kind of eliminating this habit of lazy thinking, of, you know, using the wrong language. What you're doing is you're teaching your brain to only process the best data and to reject everything else.
Yep.
And you're also building yourself a kind of architecture that is like, you know, has a very strong foundation. And, you know, it's like comparing like Notre Dame Cathedral with, you know, some stupid block building in the Soviet Union or something. You know, it's like you're using you're using the highest quality materials and you're producing the highest quality thing, which you then live in and which then serves you. And so that is like absolutely the best thing you can do for yourself, is be precise. Because yes, I get the 100% get the jigsaw puzzle analogy, and your puzzle's a mess if you're putting in bent pieces. But what's even more important is that the pieces themselves are wrong. They can easily be the wrong pieces. Doesn't matter if they're bent, if they're not even the right pieces. They can be pieces from another puzzle. They can make up a picture that at the end is supposed to be a picture of a meadow, and it's a picture that's like half of a car, and like, you know, it's like the puzzle doesn't make any sense. And so much of this is also a function of allowing ourselves to reject wholeheartedly this kind of sheep mentality that is so prevalent in the poker world, where it's like people learn from what they see other players doing and what they see other players saying. And like you said, like Greg told me they always have it in this spot. Well, and Greg's never wrong. Or even worse, Greg seems like he knows what he's doing because he's always here. And like he always has like a good stack of chips in front of him. Like I've never seen him get stacked, and like, yeah, he kind of holds himself up. I was listening to a really interesting poker podcast the other day where it was Nick Vertici's podcast, and he was interviewing Bart Hansen, and he was talking about, he's like, oh, Bart, like, we've known each other for a long time. We go all the way back to the commerce days in LA in like the early 2000s. And Bart's like, yeah, we do. And he's like, when I first saw you, this is Nick saying, to Bart, when I first saw you, I was always afraid to play with you. He's like, because you just carried yourself with such authority, and you just always seemed like you were just this crusher. And, you held yourself out with such authority and blah, blah, blah. And like, and so like, I was always intimidated by that and blah, blah, blah. And like, and I thought that was interesting because that's such a common reaction. And I'm not even saying that like Bart was trying to kind of like put on airs or anything, but I think that when you're a newer player or you're in a new environment, like your response is like, oh, that person looks like they're really good. And what's even worse is if you say that person looks like they're really good, and therefore I'm going to listen to and adopt into my own poker vocabulary what they're saying and how they're talking about hands.
Yep.
And I'm going to kind of put on that suit so then I can then move forward. And that what's so dangerous about that is that it multiplies, because you're teaching yourself, you're inputting bad data, and then you're spitting out that bad data, and then you're getting feedback. Maybe you get positive feedback, so you increase what you're doing, and it's terrible. So I think precise language is absolutely everything. 100%.
Yep. Because the longer that you commit the same reasoning fallacy for within your own mind, the greater the extent to which you no longer think it's a fallacy. So if I normalize something like a way of acting, a way of being, let's say that like early on in my life, I normalized the idea that I'm going to smoke 20 cigarettes a day. Well, 10 years later, maybe sometime I stop smoking, but it's very easy for me to just keep doing that. Whereas like right now, I've quit smoking for a couple of years now. If you just told me to smoke a bunch of cigarettes, it would be like, that's so like not okay and weird, and I don't want to do that. It's bad for me, and it's going to make me feel like shit later. And what if I get addicted again and stuff like that? So when we're in, and obviously there's some physiological, it's a bad analogy there because there's some physiological addiction things going on, but it happens with mental addiction as well, and just like going around the same neural pathways time and time again. It's just much easier if you place a marble in a ditch and you like roll it and it sort of rolls around this track. Let's say if there's barriers there and you've dug like a little ditch, it's not going to leave that circuit, right? It's going to stay in that circuit. Whereas if you roll a marble along a table where you've not actually dug any sort of grooves for it to go along, it can go in all kinds of different directions depending on which way the wind blows. So I think it's really important to understand that these fallacies in your reasoning that you have as a poker player, they're not instantiated yet. They're not ingrained yet just because you have them once or twice. It's easy to actually say, hold on a minute. Does that sound like a good sort of thought process? Does that, pass my reliability test as we talked about? Is there emotional interference? Does it just come from the fact that Greg said it, that you should do that? Or is it like something I can truly believe in? Because if the answer is that you can't really know what you're talking about and it's something that's actually very dubious, try to interrupt it the first day or week or month that you have it. Try not to normalize it and ingrain it and do it for years, because you will end up as a poker player who says they never bluff in some spot that's massively overbluffed, and you'll be totally wrong. You'll be in the exploitative miss. You'll be completely wrong for years, and you won't be able to snap out of it. And even when I tell you in our session that spot's overbluffed, and even though you understand it in the moment when we have that conversation, I can't completely undig the ditch. I can't get rid of your past neural pathways that quickly. I can't uninstall the bad software that you spent years validating by repeating it. So do break the cycle of bad language, bad habits, bad knowledge as soon as you can. As soon as you suspect there might be something untoward about it, that's when you want to intervene.
Yeah. Great.
Cool. So we'll wrap up there.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right, guys. Well, you know what to do. And that is, of course, Oh, we haven't done Pete versus Troll. That's a shame. We normally do Pete versus Troll. I haven't been trolled very much.
Forget? You haven't been trolled very much.
I haven't been trolled very. I was trolled actually by someone who I had to remove from the channel because they said something to the effect of the best time for Pete to quit a session is before he begins because he'll just wail it all off at 200 zoom. And like one statement like that, I think it's like kind of funny, but the same person had been like going around different bits of content saying nasty things. Basically, some people are very, very upset that I'm not that well known, that I'm not Doug Polk or Phil Galfond. There are some people out there that just really can't stand anyone that's not the overlord. It's like this false gods thing, I think, that when you're not that big in the industry, but you do kind of sound like you're trying to help others and teach others, that you must be like smited down in some way. So I will say to the person that went around a bunch of my different content making personal attacks, too bad, bro. You're not gonna get me to feel bad about myself. I'm really confident that I'm doing what I'm doing, and I'm really happy that your account has been blocked from all of our content, and I will continue to block any instance of you sticking your maggoty head above the soil. I will whack you with the spade and send you back down to the depths below. And that does it for this week's Pete versus Troll.
That's a good one. And don't forget to like and subscribe to, if you can also rate us on Spotify or iTunes, that would be really helpful too. I guess it's Apple Podcasts, not iTunes, but that would be really helpful too, because it helps the podcast, and we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, and give us some other, like, troll me a bit better this week, guys. You were a bit lame this week, so see if you can do a bit better, and you might make it onto next week's end edition of that segment. All right, Melissa, it's been a fascinating one. I look forward to the topic you throw at me next week, and thank you to everyone out there for listening. We'll see you next time on Poker Distilled.
Bye.